Hey everybody, Miss Maritello here, going to talk about domain and range today. So domain of a function is going to be the set of all of its possible inputs. Remember, input is like the x value, so all the possible x values that the graph could have, and then graph or table or equation, and then range would be all the possible outputs. So again, outputs are like the y values. So big thing, domain, we think x, range, we think y. All the possible values or all the values on the graph. We're going to look at a table, and this one specifically, it tells us, assume that our table is discrete. So remember, discrete means that if you were to think about the graph, the points would not be connected. So then a lot of times for domain and range, we think about writing an interval, but we actually wouldn't have that because this table specifically is discrete. So we're actually just going to have to list out the x values, and then for the range, just list out the y values. And we would write it again as a set. So we know when we write a set, we use the braces, or sometimes I call them the fancy brackets. So for domain, then we're literally just listing the x values. So -3, -2, -1, 0, and 1. And again, I have those braces. It is preferred that you put them in numerical order. And then again, notice that it's not an interval because we have a discrete graph. So there wouldn't be anything in between -3 and 2 or in between -2 and 1. So you'd have to list out each individual x value. We know that it's not an interval also because of the braces, the fancy brackets. When we go to do the range, it's almost the same thing. We're just listing out all the y values. So 6, 10, 14, 18, and 22. So each of those y values. If you were to look at the graph from this, say that you're not as comfortable with looking at the table, if you were to graph each of those ordered pairs, this is what your graph would have looked like. So you would have just listed each of the x values and then each of the y values. Notice again, you can't write it as an interval because you just have each point. If you were to do the same table, but then for a continuous function, again, looking at the same ordered pairs, but if it had been continuous, then the ordered pairs would be connected with a line. So then you would have points in between -3 and -2, and in between -2 and -1, and in between -1 and 0, and 0 and 1. So all those decimals and fractions in between those numbers would be included, so then you have to write an interval. So our domain then would be from -3 to 1, and notice we have brackets on both numbers because the points are on the graph. You have the ordered pairs, so you would assume that they're filled in. And then kind of the same thing for the range. We'd have from 6 to 22, again, brackets because we have those ordered pairs on the graph. They'd be filled in dots. And then just the difference, again, with this graph, same ordered pairs that we saw before, but because it's continuous, then we have to be connecting all the ordered pairs, so we'd have the line in there. And again, that's why we have the interval, because we're including all those fractions or decimals that would be in between each of the integers. Okay. So taking a look at the graph then, I always kind of think domain, again, we know we're thinking x, but I always think because we know we're looking at the x-axis, I like to think, okay, so we know we're going then from left to right. So from left to right. So you'll start with the most negative numbers and then move to the right. So I know when I'm looking at then at my smallest x value, it should be -8. And then there's no breaks or anything in the graph. I have graph, still graph, still graph, still graph, still graph, and then it stops at the x value of 8. And again, I know this, sometimes people are tempted to put a 3, but remember that's the y value, we need the x. So we have to use both x values, so we should have -8 and then to 8. And again, we have brackets on both sides of that, or both numbers, because both are filled in dots included on the graph, so we got the brackets. When we do the range, we're thinking about the y value. So then I always kind of think, okay, we're looking at the y-axis, so then I have to go from the bottom to the top. So our lowest y value should be -2. Again, it comes from the ordered pair 1, -2, but we have to list the y value, so we put the -2. And then our highest y value should be 8. The highest y value in the graph should be the 8. So then our range is going to go from -2 to 8. And again, we have closed dots, so we're going to put brackets on both numbers. If we were to change the graph up a little bit, this one's a little bit trickier because we have the hole in there, and then also notice we have the arrow. Remember, it still is a function. Even if you were trying to do your vertical line test, this part here where you have the hole, you have that little jump in there, that's still okay because the vertical, like it would still pass the vertical line test because it's going to go through the point that's filled in. But then remember, when it hits the open circle, that's not really a point on the graph. So it's really considered to only be hitting the graph once because the open circle doesn't count. There's really no point there. And so when we go to do our domain, then kind of like the other one, it still starts at -8. Sometimes people think they have to stop here at -5, but that's not correct because even though there's a hole here, we do still have a point at 5. It just happens to be up higher. So we can keep going past the -5, then we have graph, we have graph, we have graph, and then notice this one, it goes on forever, and we see that because of the arrow. So then we're going to be going all the way to infinity. And kind of think to yourself, what do I have to do with interval notation when I have infinity? You need a parentheses on it. So we're going to have the bracket with the -8 because of the closed dot, but then because we have infinity, we have to have the parenthesis. When we go to write the range out again, we're going from bottom to top. So technically some people start it, they make the mistake of starting it at -2, but really this arrow though is going to go all the way down forever. If I could extend the graph, that arrow is going to go down. So we really need to start our range at -infinity because that is eventually going to go even lower than the -2 would be. So we have to start our range at -2, and then notice we have the graph, but then the graph stops at 4. So when you look at that 4, even though we have the open circle here, we do have a point at 4 right here that is filled in. So because there is one filled in point, we can put the bracket with the 4. And then notice we have a space. We don't have anything in between 4 and 7. But then we start again at 7 and we go all the way to 8 for our y values. So then you have to have that union to show that you have another interval section. And then that part does, both of the numbers have the brackets because they both have closed dots. So you can have the brackets with the 7 and the 8. All right, hopefully that was helpful. Thanks for listening.